Alright, we're back. Shooting part 3 here of volume 19 of my education series. Alright, and so where I ended there was about how there's similar stories of draconian rulers. Even the word draconian in English is, considered like a bad thing. So it's pretty clear that there are some forms of evil snakes out there. To me, you don't really have to believe that. Anyway, there's only one other thing about ancient Sumer I want to mention, which is that ancient Sumer had a myth of the ideal king. And there's a word for that. If you go back and watch the ancient Sumerian tablets guy from my last video, he talks about that myth. He cites a book that includes it. So that idea of the ideal king and the Messiah is in ancient Sumer. Everything else I'm going to talk about as it relates to Judaism, I would say either is about Noah or afterwards. And if you believe in reincarnation and the idea that people who are here for the whole cycle have been here for about 25,000 years, then that ideal king would have been here before Noah, through Noah's age, and even today. Like when Jesus said the return of the Son of Man, I think he's talking about reincarnation personally. So that would imply that Jesus has already been incarnated, and that he is the son of a man. And what man that is, most likely, in my view, it would be the reincarnation of Abraham. But there's no real way to prove that. So Noah is directed by God to go and preach, a gospel of looking away from service to self, from the kind of selfish things that consumed people in the days of Noah. Many people, like Graham Hancock, think there was a highly technologically advanced civilization at that time, and that civilization corrupted people. For example, the Sumerian tablets talk a lot about alcohol. And so the same people who are promoting the consumption of alcohol are also promoting the consumption of blood. And that's also echoed in the Bhagavad Gita, the consumption of blood. So we see it, there's parallels with stuff all over the place. And the Sarvastari River in the Bhagavad Gita mirrors some of the rivers of the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is Kurdistan, and that's where that's near where Ur was, and we still have the ziggurat of Ur. You can still trace the location of these places from the Bible, and see where Abraham left when he came from Ur, to Israel. And it's a little weird that Abraham, after the flood, wasn't just born in Israel, like why God made that pilgrimage, but I think the point of that was just to get Abraham to begin to believe, because God obviously loves to test people's faith and then prove through prophecy, typically, that God is going to take care of them. So the Abrahamic covenant, as I said, I believe it was about 12,000 years ago, because the flood was 13,000 years ago, and Noah was still alive when Abraham was born, and Noah lived to be 800 years old. So that certainly puts it at between 11 and 12,000 years ago. And as I said just a minute ago, they reset the timeline when they written the Code of Hammurabi, which was given by giants, which just implies that the Nephilim rulers, just wanted an easier time, and so they wiped history and created a new language, most likely, and then just, you know what I'm saying, they just changed history. And so we see after the flood of Noah, there are still giants. So even though giants were like part of the reason for the flood, clearly the flood, which is our sun sending out a micronova, and then part of that micronova involved a projectile hitting a glacial or an ice sheet, and then causing massive amounts of flood and earth catastrophe. but God saves the people who are not supposed to, who are good people, and then some people end up underground and surviving it. Anyway, this highly advanced civilization of Atlantis gets wiped out, and God begins again with less genetic manipulation on the planet, less moral debauchery, and begins a new covenant that is described with circumcision. You're supposed to let the corners of your hair like grow extended. There's a lot of laws that are ascribed to Judaism, and the language of Hebrew is like a scalpel. It's very precise, and it draws on the frequencies of just like the universe to convey thought very well. English uses all the consonants of English can be produced by the front of the tongue. Hebrew has some like ch, some back of the throat consonants. So Judaism also has disputed texts and differences among Jews. Like there are Jews for Jesus. There are, a lot of different varieties of beliefs in Judaism, and some people adhere to the law more than others, but there is a notion that Jesus tried to correct, which is that obedience to the law is equivalent to satisfying God, and it's clearly not true because we know that the texts are taken from Sumerian sources, so there most likely have been changes to the texts and the sources and the laws, so God would know that and not create a system where obedience means everything. God does want us to show our devotion. God wants us to make, circumcise our children, and or maybe not. I think that's what God wants, but that could not be true. God asked that of Abraham, at least. And God wants, we get bar mitzvahed as Jews, and you're not supposed to get tattoos or do other things to kind of change the appearance of yourself. And those are all, and then you're supposed to keep a certain diet. There's also some weirder laws, like about when you're allowed to have sex, and a lot of other things that might not really make sense to most people, and are less widely practiced than the base form of the religion, which is just kind of the Torah, basically. And the different factions of Judaism, like some Jews don't believe in the holiday of Esther, which I believe is like Ishtar. And there's other issues with like Hanukkah. Some Jews don't think that's a holiday. Pretty much everyone agrees about Passover, and yeah, there's other differences. I don't know the differences among Jews so well. I was kind of raised in a liberal Jewish community, but when I was very young, I was part of a very conservative Jewish community, and the people are pretty nice. And it's not a bad gig. It's just harder on you if you're in a society like we are today. Okay. So one interesting thing is that the Jews blow a ram's horn, and that's from the age of Aries, I believe. And Egyptians also had Taurus, and they had bulls, I believe, but that could also be Baal or Baphomet. It's hard to really distinguish if these are influenced by celestial things, or if we're talking about higher density evil beings, but those are some interesting religious practices of Jews and Egyptians. And yeah, there is a Hebrew month that is named after Tammuz, so that's not a very good thing. That clearly shows that there was some corruption. And so after God formed this covenant with Abraham, there was clearly a lot of time that passed where Judaism continued to be practiced, and the tradition was passed down through the generations, And we don't like see a ton of references to Judaism in ancient Sumer, but that also could have just been wiped, like the Book of Enoch. So we know that the Book of Enoch was widely known in the day of Jesus, and so we can probably say there are probably other references to similar religious texts that we just don't understand. And then one of the things also from that video from the Sumerian Tablets playlist in my last one is that it talks about how culturally the rulers that existed since the dawn of the age of Noah, when they would change the language, so they would take over a country, they would change the language slightly, and then rewrite the texts, and then most likely alter the texts of that country, the religious texts, in order to promote their agenda. And so over time, you can kind of see how things get skewed. But if you have original sources like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Book of Adam and Eve, you can take it back to the original and see what the actual references are or what the source material is. And then you have a better understanding of how things happened. And what I'll close with tonight is that same guy, Poltorok, he said that the Romans, they did a similar thing, but he doesn't think that they edited the religious texts. And what we're going to get into in my next video is how the Romans did not want Judaism to stay in existence, and the Romans are also obsessed with bloodlines and believe they descend from rulers of ancient Sumer, and they have a divine right to rule, and that other people are not on their level, that they are the descendants of the progenitors, or the that race of beings from 50,000 years ago that took over this evil kingdom that serves Tammuz and Enki or Halel ben Shakar, Lucifer. So we have these beings who run Rome who believe they're the descendants of these people who serve very evil beings, like Nephilim is one word for them. And so